For most of human history, we shared the planet with animals far larger than anything alive around us today. Mammoths, giant sloths, enormous flightless birds, and marsupials heavier than a car. Many of them had already survived dramatic shifts in climate. Then humans entered their worlds, and many disappeared. Coincidence is not proof, but across these 10 extinctions, the human fingerprints become increasingly difficult to ignore. Number 10. Diprotodon, Australia's giant marsupial. More than 40,000 years ago, Australia was home to animals that would seem almost unfamiliar today. Giant kangaroos moved through the landscape. Enormous reptiles survived in some regions, while massive flightless birds shared the continent with mammals unlike anything still alive. Among the largest was Diprotodon. A distant relative of modern wombats, Diprotodon was the largest known marsupial ever to exist. An adult could weigh well over a ton. Its lineage had survived enormous environmental changes. Then humans entered Australia. Not long afterward, much of the continent's megafauna disappeared. The sequence looks suspicious. Humans arrive, and large animals vanish. It is tempting to stop there. But prehistoric extinction is rarely that simple. Australia itself was changing. Rainfall shifted, freshwater availability changed, and vegetation responded. Some regions became increasingly difficult environments for large animals. Unlike a killing preserved at an archaeological site, extinction rarely leaves behind one decisive piece of evidence. There is no single fossil that tells us why the last Diprotodon died. Instead, scientists reconstruct the process from many smaller clues: fossil dates, ancient vegetation, environmental records, human settlement, and patterns of disappearance from one region to another. Some studies find extinction patterns that are difficult to explain without substantial human pressure. Others show that environmental deterioration also mattered, particularly at a regional level. That leaves Diprotodon in an uncomfortable position. Humans were present, the timing fits, and human involvement is plausible. But timing is not proof. That distinction so matters throughout this documentary because proving that humans encountered an animal is relatively easy. Proving that humans caused an entire species to disappear is much harder. The two pressures may also have worked together. Imagine a population already struggling because food and water are becoming less predictable. Now, introduce a new predator that works in groups, uses tools, learns quickly, and can target large animals repeatedly. The hunters do not need to kill every Diprotodon. They only need to add enough mortality that births can no longer replace deaths. For a large, slow-reproducing animal, that threshold may be surprisingly low. So Diprotodon gives us suspicious timing and a plausible ecological mechanism. What it does not give us is a clear prehistoric kill. For that, we need an animal we know humans hunted. Number 9. The woolly mammoth, the Ice Age giant humans actually killed. Few animals represent the Ice Age as completely as the woolly mammoth. Its body was built for cold. Dense hair covered the skin, fat helped conserve heat, and enormous curved tusks projected from the skull. For thousands of years, mammoth herds moved across the cold grasslands of Eurasia and North America. Humans moved through many of those same landscapes. Here, the evidence becomes more direct. At archaeological sites across the mammoth's former range, mammoth remains occur alongside human tools. Some bones carry cut marks. Other sites contain evidence that carcasses were processed. At a smaller number of locations, researchers have argued that mammoths were deliberately killed. So this part is not really the mystery. Humans hunted mammoths. The harder question is whether hunting explains why mammoths disappeared. While humans were expanding through mammoth territory, the Ice Age world itself was changing. Temperatures rose, vegetation shifted, large areas of open mammoth steppe began to shrink or fragment. Habitats that had supported mammoth populations for generations were becoming different environments. That creates exactly the kind of situation that makes extinction difficult to reconstruct. Suppose mammoth populations are already becoming smaller because suitable habitat is disappearing. Now, add human hunting. Neither force needs to be strong enough to cause extinction by itself. Together, they may be enough. There is another problem. Mammoths were enormous, and that can make them seem almost impossible to eliminate. But size can be deceptive. Large mammals generally reproduce slowly. Modern elephants have long pregnancies and extended parental care, and extinct proboscideans probably faced similar biological limits. A mammoth population could not replace breeding adults quickly. Humans would not need to kill huge numbers every year. A small but persistent increase in mortality could matter across generations. Even then, the story refuses to become neat. Mammoth populations did not disappear everywhere at the same time. Some vanished earlier than others, while a few isolated populations survived for thousands of years after mainland mammoths were gone. That tells us there was no single moment when humans suddenly erased every mammoth. Different populations faced different combinations of climate change, habitat loss, isolation, and human pressure. That is why the debate continues. We know humans hunted mammoths, and we know their environment was changing. What remains difficult to measure is how much each force contributed to the final collapse. But archaeology occasionally gives us something more direct than cut marks. Sometimes the weapon itself survives. Number 8. The American mastodon, a weapon hidden inside the animal. Late Pleistocene North America was home to another giant proboscidean, the mastodon. It may look superficially similar to a mammoth, but the two were different animals. Their teeth, diets, and preferred habitats were different. Mastodons were more closely associated with wooded and wet environments. At one site in what is now Washington State, a mastodon preserved a clue that remained hidden for thousands of years. The site is called Manus. Researchers examining damage to one of the ribs found something embedded inside it, a pointed fragment of bone. Detailed analysis strengthened an extraordinary interpretation. This was not simply a splinter produced after the animal died. It was a projectile, and the projectile itself had been made from the bone of a large animal. Someone had shaped bone into a weapon and driven it into a mastodon. The site dates to roughly 13,800 years ago. That places the event before the classic Clovis archaeological tradition, which once dominated ideas about the earliest widespread people in North America. The implication is important. Humans were hunting megafauna before the period most strongly associated with Clovis hunters. But for our investigation, the most powerful part is the physical connection. A person made a weapon. The weapon struck the mastodon. The skeleton preserved the impact. Thousands of years later, archaeology reconstructed the encounter. That is much stronger than simply showing that humans and mastodons lived in the same place. Still, one projectile cannot explain an extinction. Archaeology can sometimes prove that an individual animal was hunted. Extinction requires something more. It requires enough pressure across enough time and enough populations that recovery becomes impossible. Mastodons were also living through environmental change at the end of the Pleistocene. So even with the weapon preserved inside the animal, the final cause of extinction remains a larger question. And another complication is waiting. What if humans hunted a giant species, but that species did not disappear? What if people and megafauna continued living beside one another for thousands of years? Madagascar may preserve exactly that situation. Number 7. The elephant birds. Humans exploited them, but they did not vanish immediately. Madagascar developed in isolation, producing animals found nowhere else on Earth. Among the strangest were elephant birds. These were enormous, flightless birds. Some species ranked among the heaviest birds known, with bodies weighing hundreds of kilograms. Their eggs were gigantic. To people entering Madagascar, elephant birds represented an obvious source of food. Archaeological evidence suggests that people did exploit them. Some elephant bird bones preserve marks interpreted as cutting and chopping by humans. A particularly striking group of modified bones has been dated to more than 10,000 years ago. If that interpretation and chronology are correct, humans were interacting with elephant birds far earlier than the period traditionally associated with permanent settlement on the island. But then comes the surprise. Elephant birds did not disappear 10,000 years ago. They survived much later. That creates a problem for the simplest version of human-driven extinction. If people were exploiting elephant birds thousands of years before the species vanished, then human contact alone cannot explain the extinction. Humans and elephant birds apparently coexisted, potentially for millennia. So something changed. Later in Madagascar's history, human presence became more intensive and more visible. Settlements expanded, livestock appeared, land was modified, fire was used repeatedly, and habitats changed. During the last millennium, Madagascar lost a remarkable collection of large endemic animals. Elephant birds were among them. This does not give us one dramatic scene in which hunters killed the final bird. Instead, it gives us something more realistic. Human pressure can change in scale. A small population occasionally exploiting a giant bird may be sustainable. A larger and more settled population hunting animals, taking eggs, clearing vegetation, and transforming habitat creates a very different ecological system. That distinction is crucial. The question is not simply whether humans hunted the animal. The better question is this: at what point did human pressure become too strong for the population to absorb? Elephant birds force us to abandon the idea that human arrival automatically means immediate extinction. Sometimes coexistence was possible, at least for a time. That leads to another question. How widespread was large animal hunting among early humans? Were mammoths and mastodons unusual targets? Or did humans repeatedly hunt giant prey whenever the opportunity appeared? In Mexico, another archaeological site reveals another elephant relative and another group of hunters. Number 6. Suphironius, the forgotten elephant of the Americas. When people picture Ice Age North America, they usually imagine mammoths and mastodons. But those were not the only giant proboscideans humans encountered. At a site in Sonora, Mexico called El Fin del Mundo, the end of the world, archaeologists found the remains of Cuvier. Cuvier was a gomphothere, part of another branch of the proboscidine family tree. These animals had once spread through large parts of the world. By the late Pleistocene, some survived in the Americas. At El Fin del Mundo, Cuvier remains were found associated with distinctive Clovis projectile points. The site dates to roughly 13,400 years ago. The association expands the pattern. Clovis hunters were not only capable of killing mammoths, they could target another kind of giant proboscidean as well. Different animal, different region, but the same basic technological advantage. That does not mean every Clovis community specialized in megafauna. It also does not prove that Clovis hunters caused every large animal extinction near the end of the Pleistocene. But one argument becomes harder to make. Humans were not physically incapable of killing the giants around them. They could. Cooperation and technology changed the equation. A relatively small human could participate in killing an animal many times heavier than any single hunter. When that ability appears across multiple prey species, the ecological implications become more serious. Large animals often exist at relatively low population densities, and they reproduce slowly. A population can decline without any individual hunt appearing catastrophic. One animal disappears, then another. The landscape still seems full. Years pass and the population becomes smaller. Eventually, a drought, harsh winter, or other environmental shock arrives. A population that once could recover no longer does. But El Fin del Mundo still leaves us reconstructing behavior from an archaeological association. The animal is there, the weapons are there, the hunting connection is strong. Another site takes us even closer. Farther south, archaeologists found the remains of an enormous animal alongside evidence that humans had not simply encountered it. They had processed the body. Number 5. Megatherium americanum, a prehistoric crime scene. Megatherium was one of the giants of South America, a ground sloth on a scale almost impossible to imagine from its living relatives. A large individual weighed several tons. Its limbs were powerful, its claws enormous, and when it rose onto its hind legs, it could tower over a human. For millions of years, giant ground sloths were part of American ecosystems. Then, near the end of the Pleistocene, they encountered expanding human populations. At Campo Laborde in Argentina, archaeologists found the remains of Megatherium americanum. The bones were not alone. Stone tools occurred in the same archaeological context, and marks on parts of the skeleton indicated human processing. Dating placed the event at roughly 12,600 years ago. The researchers interpreted the site as clear evidence that humans hunted and butchered Megatherium. That makes Campo Laborde a turning point. So far, we have moved through different levels of evidence. Humans overlapped with Diprotodon. They definitely hunted mammoths. A projectile struck a mastodon. Clovis hunters exploited gomphothers. Now we have a giant ground sloth, tools, butchery, and chronology together. The scene becomes much easier to reconstruct. Humans exploited an animal weighing several tons. Exactly how the kill happened is harder to know. Perhaps several hunters cooperated. Perhaps they used terrain or selected a vulnerable animal. Archaeology does not preserve every decision, but it preserves the result. One of South America's largest mammals became a human resource. That leads to a question that sounds simple, but matters enormously. How many Megatherium would people have needed to kill before the population noticed? Probably fewer than most of us imagine. Large body size creates an illusion of abundance. A giant animal contains a great deal of meat, but enormous animals generally exist in smaller numbers than small ones. The same landscape that supports thousands of small mammals may support far fewer animals weighing several tons, and large mammals cannot replace themselves quickly. Now introduce a predator able to share information, cooperate, manufacture weapons, plan, and exploit the same prey repeatedly. No single hunt needs to look disastrous. No one has to decide to exterminate Megatherium. People only need to use a valuable resource often enough. Extinction can be an unintended consequence. Ancient people did not need to understand population biology. They were surviving. But a behavior that makes sense for one group of hunters can become dangerous when repeated across a slowly reproducing species. Still, hunting is only one way humans place pressure on wildlife. After this point, the evidence begins to reveal something larger. Humans were not only removing animals from ecosystems, they were changing the ecosystems themselves. Number 4. The giant lemurs of Madagascar. When the landscape became part of the extinction, Madagascar is still famous for lemurs. But the lemurs alive today represent only a fraction of the forms that once lived there. Until relatively recently, the island supported giant lemurs far larger than any species surviving now. Some approached the size of large apes. Others had bodies and lifestyles unlike any modern lemur. For thousands of years, these animals lived in an island ecosystem isolated from mainland Africa. Then humans became part of that system. Some giant lemur bones preserve marks consistent with human butchery. That establishes direct exploitation. People ate them. But as with elephant birds, direct hunting is only part of the story. Madagascar's major wave of megafaunal disappearance happened much later than the earliest evidence proposed for human presence. By then, human activity looked very different. Settlement was more established, livestock had spread, land was increasingly altered, and fire became a major tool for changing vegetation. Habitats were transformed. Now, consider the problem from the perspective of a giant lemur. It does not need to meet a hunter to suffer from human expansion. If forest disappears, the population shrinks. If remaining habitat becomes fragmented, groups become isolated. If hunting occurs at the same time, recovery becomes slower. Then add drought or another natural stress. A population that once survived climatic fluctuations may no longer have enough ecological room to respond. This combination helps explain why Madagascar's late Holocene extinction affected so many different animals: giant lemurs, elephant birds, large tortoises, and pygmy hippos. They did not all live the same way, eat the same food, or occupy identical habitats. Yet many disappeared during the same broad period of intensifying human transformation. That does not mean every species followed one identical path. Some may have suffered more from hunting, others more from habitat loss. Climate probably mattered in some cases, but the pattern has grown beyond individual kill sites. Humans had become ecosystem engineers. Fire could change vegetation far beyond a settlement. Livestock could compete for resources and alter habitats. Agriculture could reshape where forests remained, while hunting removed large-bodied animals at the same time. The human footprint no longer had to appear directly on a bone. It could appear across the landscape. And in southwestern Madagascar, another extinct animal appears beside precisely this combination of pressures: hunting, fire, introduced animals, and environmental change. Number 3. The Malagasy pygmy hippos. When several pressures became one. Hippos once lived on Madagascar. They were different from the enormous common hippopotamuses of mainland Africa. Several endemic forms evolved on the island, generally smaller than their continental relatives. Today, they are all gone. Their disappearance raises the same difficult question, seen throughout this documentary. Was climate responsible? Did humans hunt them away? Or did several pressures converge? Archaeological work in southwestern Madagascar provides an unusually detailed picture. At ancient coastal pond sites, researchers recovered extinct megafaunal remains alongside evidence of human activity. Charcoal was present. Humans were processing food. Introduced livestock appeared. One pygmy hippo bone showed modification. The sequence itself is revealing. At those study sites, Megafauna disappeared around 1,000 years ago. That disappearance did not simply coincide with the most severe phase of an earlier dry period. Instead, it occurred as evidence for human foraging, fire, and introduced animals became increasingly prominent. For those sites, drought alone does not provide an easy explanation. Climate mattered, but the animals had already lived through environmental stress. The new factor was a changing human economy. People were no longer simply another predator entering the landscape. They brought domestic animals, burned vegetation, harvested wild resources, and reorganized parts of the environment around human needs. For a small hippo population, any one pressure might be survivable. The danger appears when several pressures operate together. Hunting reduces the population, habitat changes, water availability becomes less predictable, livestock occupy parts of the landscape, and fire alters vegetation. Then drought returns. The drought itself may be familiar. The population facing it is not. That is why the final event in an extinction is not always the only cause. Climate can deliver the last shock to a population already weakened by humans. Human hunting can finish a decline that environmental change began. Or both may interact so closely that separating them centuries later becomes almost impossible. But the Malagasy evidence shows something important. People do not need to decide to destroy a species in order to help destroy it. Every individual action can make sense. Hunt one animal, burn one area, raise livestock, clear land. Repeat those choices across generations. And eventually, the ecosystem is no longer the one the animal evolved to survive in. Yet humans can affect a giant species in an even quieter way. There may be no large animal hunt at all, no spear, and no butchered adult. Sometimes the most vulnerable part of a population is not the animal standing in front of the hunter. It is the generation that has not been born yet. Number 2. Genyornis newtoni, the giant bird threatened at the nest. Around 50,000 years ago, Australia was home to a giant flightless bird called Genyornis newtoni. It weighed perhaps around 200 kilograms. Genyornis belonged to the Dromornithids, an ancient Australian lineage of large birds whose history stretched back millions of years. Then Genyornis disappeared. Its extinction became part of the wider argument over Australia's lost megafauna. Climate, humans, or both? A clue emerged from something much smaller than the bird. Eggshell. Ancient eggshell fragments occur across Australian landscapes. Their structure and chemistry allow scientists to distinguish different kinds of birds. Researchers examining these fragments noticed a strange pattern. At more than 200 locations, eggshell attributed in the study to Genyornis showed localized burning. The pattern did not look like eggs sitting inside nests consumed evenly by large natural fires. Instead, researchers argued that it resembled the remains produced when humans collect large eggs, cook them in or near small fires, eat the contents, and discard the shell. The dates make the evidence even more interesting. The burned fragments appear after humans entered Australia. Then the Genyornis eggshell record disappears around the time the species itself vanished, roughly 47,000 years ago. If that interpretation is correct, humans were exploiting Genyornis eggs. That gives us an extinction mechanism very different from the image of hunters surrounding a giant adult bird. The pressure may have started at the nest. Killing an adult removes one animal. Taking an egg removes an animal before it ever enters the population. For a species producing many young quickly, occasional egg collection may not matter. For a large, slowly reproducing bird, repeated harvesting can be much more serious. Fewer eggs hatch, fewer juveniles survive, adults continue dying naturally. The population gets older, then smaller. Nothing about the process needs to look dramatic. No mass slaughter is required, and no hunter needs to kill hundreds of adults. The damage occurs quietly, nest by nest, season after season. There is another useful comparison. Humans also collected and ate emu eggs. Burned emu eggshell appears in the archaeological record, yet emus survived. That tells us the human behavior itself cannot be the complete explanation. Biology matters, population size matters, reproductive strategy matters, and environmental pressure matters. Genyornis may simply have been less able to absorb the additional loss. That is what makes the case so important. It shows how human predation can operate through a pathway we might otherwise overlook. Not every extinct giant needs to have died at the point of a spear. By number 2, our original question has changed. We began with timing. Then we found direct hunting, weapons, butchery, landscape transformation, and now the exploitation of reproduction itself. But one objection still remains. What if these animals were already disappearing? What if humans simply encountered populations near the end of a natural decline? The strongest possible case would look different. Find a species whose populations were not undergoing a major long-term collapse. Then humans arrive. Exploitation begins. And within a short archaeological period, the animals disappear. New Zealand gives us something very close to that. Number 1. The moa, when humans arrived and the giants vanished. Before people settled New Zealand, its ecosystems had developed in extraordinary isolation. There were no native terrestrial mammals comparable to wolves, cats, or humans hunting large animals across the ground. Birds occupied ecological roles filled by mammals elsewhere. Among them were moa. Moa were not one species. They were an entire radiation of flightless birds. Some were relatively small. Others were enormous, with the largest females weighing more than 200 kilograms. For a very long time, these birds were successful. They lived in forests, lowlands, and uplands. Different species occupied different parts of the islands. Then Polynesian settlers reached New Zealand in the late 13th century. From an evolutionary perspective, moa suddenly encountered something completely new, a predator that worked in groups, used cutting tools, controlled fire, learned quickly, and could repeatedly hunt the same prey across enormous areas. The archaeological record preserves what followed. Moa bones occur in great quantities at early human sites. Some locations show extensive carcass processing. People consumed the meat, worked moa bones into useful objects, and exploited the eggs. The hunting is not hypothetical. It is visible in the archaeological record. But there was still one possible escape from the argument. Perhaps moa populations were already collapsing. Maybe humans simply arrived during the final stage of a natural decline. Ancient DNA gave researchers a way to test that idea. By studying genetic diversity preserved in ancient moa remains, scientists reconstructed aspects of population history before human settlement. The result was striking. The populations examined did not show evidence of the severe, long-term decline expected if moa were already moving inevitably toward extinction before people arrived. Some appear to have been stable. Others may even have been increasing. That changes the story. Viable populations existed. Humans arrived, intensive exploitation followed, and then moa disappeared. The entire sequence occurred in only a few centuries. This is extraordinarily fast in evolutionary terms. One modeling study asked how many people would have been required to create that collapse. The answer challenges the assumption that prehistoric extinctions require huge human populations. A relatively small number of people expanding through the landscape and repeatedly hunting moa could generate enough mortality to cause a rapid decline. Again, slow reproduction matters. A large bird population can look abundant even while it is becoming unsustainable. At first, hunters find animals easily and the landscape still appears full. Then nearby populations become smaller. Hunters travel farther while the remaining animals become concentrated in more remote places. Eventually, reproduction cannot replace what is being removed. An animal that once seemed permanent becomes rare. Then it disappears. No one needs to intend extinction. That point matters. Early settlers were not looking at moa through the lens of modern conservation biology. They had entered a new environment containing an enormous source of food. Every individual hunt could be rational. The combined effect was not. Humans were also changing parts of New Zealand through fire. Large areas of vegetation were burned, especially in some regions. So hunting was not necessarily the only human pressure on moa. Habitat change mattered too. But unlike many cases earlier in this list, the chronology here is unusually compressed. Moa are present before substantial human settlement. Human exploitation is archaeologically obvious. Genetic evidence does not support a long pre-human collapse. Then, within only a few centuries, all moa are gone. That is why they belong at number 1. Not because humans explain every prehistoric extinction. They do not. And not because climate can be ignored. It cannot. Moa matter because they show what a strong case for rapid human-driven extinction actually looks like. These birds had existed in New Zealand for an immense span of time. Humans had been there for only a tiny fraction of that history, when the last moa disappeared. And that brings us back to the question we started with. Did ancient humans merely witness the disappearance of the world's giants? For some species, the answer remains complicated. Diprotodon still sits inside a difficult Australian debate. Mammoths faced major climatic and ecological changes. Across different continents, environmental stress and human pressure often overlapped so closely that assigning one simple cause would be misleading. But other evidence cannot be dismissed as climate. Weapons embedded in bones. carcasses processed with stone tools, giant animals butchered at archaeological sites, eggs collected and cooked, landscapes transformed through fire and settlement, and populations that remained viable until a new predator entered their world. Humans were not the largest animals in these ecosystems, and we were not the fastest. We did not have the largest teeth or the strongest claws. Our advantage was different. We cooperated, learned from one another, and shared information. We made weapons. We controlled fire. And we could change our behavior faster than many large animals could adapt to us. That ability made humans remarkably successful. But success left traces. Bones, stone tools, burned eggshell, ancient DNA, and empty ecological spaces where giant animals once lived. Those fragments now allow us to reconstruct events nobody recorded in writing. Perhaps the most unsettling part is how incomplete that record still is. Some prehistoric extinctions have only recently begun to reveal clear evidence of human involvement. Others remain unresolved, their final populations disappearing tens of thousands of years ago and leaving behind scattered fossils, uncertain dates, and unanswered questions. So we no longer need to ask whether ancient humans were capable of helping drive giant animals to extinction. They were. The question that remains is how many other disappearances still carry a human fingerprint we have not yet learned to recognize.